Nonprofit Lab, a podcast dedicated to the ongoing discovery of how we can all be a part of bigger social change through the lens of the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Puya Porak. I'm an industrial engineer, a fan of the transitions between seasons, and CEO of Match Nice, a social impact tech startup with a mission to connect the nonprofit ecosystem and maximize social impact. Join us on our startup journey as we look to uncover and shake up the status quo in the world of nonprofits. On today's episode, I have the privilege of speaking with Stacy Sawin, founder of FinAbility, a survivor-founded nonprofit that financially empowers survivors of domestic abuse. Using her background in tech and finance, Stacy is building digital tools that make financial education and resources safely accessible to survivors through a trauma-informed lens. Survivor voices inform everything that they do, and FinAbility is working towards a future in which everyone has the financial security to live free from abuse and thrive. As a stalking survivor herself, Stacy spent over 3 years seeking legal protection from her harm doer, which exposed her to the challenges survivors of domestic violence and abuse and stalking endure. This prompted Stacy to volunteer over 600 hours at women's service organizations and to earn an MBA from London Business School, where she studied entrepreneurship and change management. Prior to business school, Stacy was a management consultant at Deloitte, where she worked with nonprofits and government agencies. Stacy founded FinAbility in October of 2020 and is committed to ensuring all survivors have access to the financial resources needed to live independently and thrive. In this episode, we talk about Stacy's journey of discovering the needs of survivors, what it looks like to start a digital-first nonprofit, the importance of nonprofit partnerships for success, the challenges of partnerships when it comes to competitive funding, how overhead expenses and payroll are as important for donors to understand and support as programming, and how nonprofits can communicate those needs to donors in an effective and meaningful way. Here's my conversation with Stacy. Hi, Stacy. Welcome to the Nonprofit Lab. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. And how are you?
Oh, thanks for asking. I'm doing great. It's so nice to have you on the show. I was so excited about our conversation that we had a number of weeks back as a digital first nonprofit founder with FinAbility. And I'm so excited to share your journey and what you're working on. So tell us about that. Tell us about your journey into the nonprofit sector and why you launched FinAbility and what is FinAbility?
Yes. So unfortunately, the inspiration for the nonprofit came from lived experience. So I just graduated from college, moved to DC, my first time living in a big city. And about a month into my first job, I was both harassed and stalked by my manager. And it's something that escalated to the point where I decided to seek criminal and civil protections against him. And I spent 3 years in and out of the courtroom where I was exposed to dozens of women trying to seek protection from stalkers, abusive partners, etc. And I was able to become safe. It was devastating to see that the majority of these women received no support from the court system whatsoever. And it wasn't due to the validity of their case, but rather due to their lack of financial resources, not being able to take time off from work, not being able to afford childcare, or not being able to hire a third party that could serve their harm doer the paperwork to show up to court. And I've since learned that this financial insecurity and the lack of financial resources, not only does it prevent women being able to get legal protections, it prevents them from being able to leave abusive relationships. I've had the privilege to interview over 100 survivors of domestic abuse, nonprofit professionals, and advocates, and we've learned that 99% experience financial financial abuse in their relationship. So their harm doer is controlling their access to cash, credit, physical assets. In addition, many of these men and women, they don't have access to their phone, to transportation, and it can make it nearly impossible for them to leave, but also impossible not to return. It takes the average survivor 7 attempts to successfully leave that abusive relationship. And a lot of time, it's that financial insecurity that drives them back. So knowing all of this, that's where the inspiration from FinAbility came. So we're a survivor-founded and led nonprofit that was built to really financially empower survivors of domestic abuse, and still are always interviewing survivors, holding focus groups, and based off of the solutions they want to see, we've been developing digital tools that can really help them build financial skills and access financial services that otherwise might not be safe for them to access.
I can't say how inspired I am by you taking this traumatic experience, taking action not only to seek healing for yourself, but to also elevate all of the other survivors of domestic violence around you. I commend you on your vulnerability in sharing that story as well. And, I'll just reciprocate by saying that I grew up in a very tumultuous household myself. I was witness to some of those things, and I saw how difficult it was for my mom to step away from that situation and the pressures that were put on her and us as kids to survive in that situation. And it really did feel like a really lonely experience where there weren't that many resources for that support. So I'm also inspired by the research that you've done around this. In the introduction, I mentioned that you volunteered over 600 hours at women's service organizations after your MBA and studied entrepreneurship and change management to figure out how you can make a difference. Tell me a little bit more about that journey of discovery for you and some of, I know you to a few of those lessons learned, but what else did that shift for you and how did it inform your approach to make FinAbility a digital first nonprofit?
So much of that was my personal healing journey. Where I volunteered in DC was a transition home who've experienced chronic homelessness, and it's about 75% of those women who are domestic abuse survivors. It was one of the only things I could safely do at the time because of the stalking I was experiencing. It was a way I could safely get out of the house, feel like I had some control and was giving back, but it definitely planted the seeds in my head to see how a nonprofit operates, to really start meeting with the beneficiaries that eventually my organization would serve. And I think that's where the wheels started turning to think, how could we do something like this, but more scalable? The organization was amazing, but they have 40 bed spots. And every year, it's amazing what they do for the 40 women in each of those beds. But there was a 2-year wait list at times of people who wanted these services and just couldn't have it at the time because of capacity. After a bit of time, I was fortunate enough that my old employer offered to pay for me to go to business school, and definitely took that as an opportunity to get access to an education on entrepreneurship, but also really immerse myself in the world of finance and see what exists here and is there anything that we can leverage to really support this demographic that I care so deeply. It just felt like a perfect marriage coming from being a technology consultant, having immersed myself in this world a bit with DV survivors, and now seeing I have connections in financial services. We might be able to marry all this together to really make a difference. The digital aspect has really come into play. 95% of survivors, they're never going to call a hotline. They're not going to go into shelter. When they're looking for support, they turn to friends, family, and to Google. And when they go to Google, we want to make sure that when they type, I'm experiencing XYZ, I'm really scared of my partner, he controls all the money, I want them to be able to find the resources that they need. And that was really where we're like, digital is important. This is a gap that exists, and we want people to be safe.
I appreciate how you're thinking about it in terms of scale, right? And how do we reach and impact more survivors, people looking to get out of these really difficult situations? One of the things that I've been thinking about is the different roles that nonprofits can play in a specific cause area. You absolutely need to have these safe havens and shelters for women to immediately escape. You also need to be able to provide the holistic support, which provide the financial empowerment for people to sustain and have the courage and the resources to find independence from these difficult situations. So, how do you see FinAbility partnering with and integrating with all of the other resources that are out there for victims?
Absolutely. It was incredibly important to us that we weren't duplicative to the mission space and we're really collaborative. So before even developing our mission and deciding where we were going to focus, we spoke to a lot of direct service providers and other organizations that currently work with survivors. And that was a big piece of the research to see what are some of the gaps that they see, what are areas maybe they aren't best suited to support, but know are important. It's about a third of advocates who are DV survivors themselves and also struggling with their finances. And most people who work in the domestic abuse mission space don't have an education on finance. So they often feel like they're not the best people to really support survivors in that capacity. And then you look at financial service organizations and they don't understand the unique considerations to support survivors, the extra safety concerns, and also survivors' trust has been violated time and time again, not only by their harm doer, but by institutions. So it's really important that there are organizations that survivors know understand them. After many of those conversations, that maybe we can be the bridge and fill in that space. But that's only step one. You find the gap maybe in the mission space, but then you have to integrate into it holistically. And it's been a multi-year process of really trying to build trust with organizations and partnerships to see how we can best support each other.
Can you give us an example of what maybe one of those partnerships looks like? Because it's one of the big questions that sparked the idea for Match Nice is if you have so many different mission aligned nonprofit people working towards really the same cause in different phases of beneficiary journey, how is everyone playing and working together towards creating lasting outcomes? So, what's an example of how FinAbility has been working with other nonprofits in this mission?
So, one of our dearest partners is the Arizona Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And it started with a cold email. I went to their info page, reached out, went to their LinkedIn, found employees there, and was eventually connected. Just asked the dumb questions. I'm the newcomer to the mission space and wanted to understand how it's structured, how it operates, what they do. And they were so generous with their time and blows my mind how the relationship has evolved since then. When we came up with our initial concept, they connected us with survivors and advocates, and they were really our avenue to having those first rounds of interviews to hone and focus the idea. And then when we developed our first product, they piloted it for us and gave us more feedback. And now I think we've reached a point where I hope we're giving as much as they're giving us. We're always trying to let them know what financial resources we're coming by. If they have unique questions, they send them our way. Just a lot of time. And the feedback they gave us was we needed to know that you were listening. And once we knew you were listening, we were ready to partner.
What other lessons have you learned from that partnership engagement? Because there are so many obstacles, stars that need to align for successful nonprofit partnerships to happen. Are there any other big lessons that you've learned from this particular engagement or other endeavors?
Money is a toughie because, as I'm sure you're very, very aware, it's very competitive to get funding in the mission space, and no organization wants you to come in and steal that I've been relying on year after year. So, finding organizations that really believe we can grow the pie together and that collaboration is important has been essential. We do see some organizations where it's more of a zero-sum game and they're a little bit more hesitant to welcome and greet us. And that's nothing against those organizations. We're still learning about how to talk about funding with partners and other organizations in the mission space. We sometimes blanket statements say, we will never apply for this grant. It's off limits to us. It's really challenging to work around. We've been really trying to just find those gems of people who want to grow the pie with us.
That's One of the bigger insights that we've uncovered throughout our journey of discovery in the nonprofit sector is that many nonprofit leaders are finding collaboration is way easier when it comes to programming, but less so when it comes to funding, and that it can be a very protective sandbox of fear of, oh my gosh, what if we lose X amount of, shares of our funding to this other nonprofit? But I think what you're getting at is so true, is it's how can we shift the perspective to growing the pie versus I'm taking a slice of your yummy donor pie, whatever the funding pie analogy is there. You mentioned like the approach has evolved to reduce some of the guard that other nonprofits might have when you're approaching them with the partnership. What has that approach look like?
Finding the right person, the organization to connect with has been really important. And we always lead with giving first, understanding how can our program support you? What are some of the gaps you have? And trying to let them know that we're really here to support them and that we're in this together. I think if we can demonstrate that over time, and they believe we're a good partner to them, that's where we've seen the shift in mindset take place. I would also say it helps once you have your first partner. One organization we're also really proud to partner with is Raphael House, and they're a direct service provider in the greater Portland area. I think the world of, and I know the community does as well. And when they invite us to speak at events or connect us to other leaders, that really opens doors for us.
Yes, approach the right people, shared vision, mission, all of that is great. And learning seems to be working really well for you. So I commend you in stepping into such a difficult territory that not only you, but many other nonprofits are facing right now, is cracking the nut of collaboration in the midst of a hyper competitive funding environment. Good job in the success that you've had with those partnerships. And hopefully those nonprofit leaders, people that are listening, are inspired to bring some of those walls down. And I love the give first attitude that you've brought to these partnerships as well. So I should have maybe led with this question, but tell us a little bit more about FinAbility itself, the resources that you're providing, the services, how people are finding you, where you are in your programming and journey as a nonprofit now, and where you hope to be in the next year or so.
On the FinAbility website, we have two primary resources slash services right now. So one, we have a trauma-informed financial resource guide for survivors. Throughout the many interviews we've done, we've been documenting most commonly asked questions. What we've also come to understand is that survivors are on a journey, and this resource guide really follows the 4 stages of the survivor journey and directs folks to resources that might be relevant based off of that phase. So in the first phase, you have survivors who know something might be wrong with their relationship, but aren't necessarily thinking it's domestic abuse, accepting that label of a survivor yet. So in that module, it's more about how can I protect my finances if something goes wrong? Is this abuse? What does that look like? Am I safe? And then moving into our second phase of the journey, you have folks who are getting ready to actually leave that abusive relationship. And this can be the most dangerous and frightening time for the survivor. So in this phase, it's how do I discreetly save money? How do I get an emergency credit card? Do I need to start separating my finances from my harm doer? And what does that look like? And then moving into the third phase, we have survivors who have just left that abusive relationship and are really able to take that first deep breath for the first time. And this is where we direct people to resources about financial trauma and give them the tools to start evaluating what their current state is. Do I have course debt? What does my credit look like? Do I have money in the bank, and can I safely access that or not? And then going to the fourth phase, which is a bit more traditional, this is where folks are really feeling ready to begin building that financial security. So resources about budgeting, building credit, and really setting those financial goals to set you up for future success. We've been really excited that the resource guide has just gotten really overwhelmingly positive feedback from survivors and our partner organization. Folks have been able to use it to open their first bank account ever or look at their credit report for the first time. So it's been amazing to see people going to the website and actually using this guide, and all self-service. And we just launched a complimentary service, which are virtual financial courses. So if someone is in the resource guide and says, hey, like this was helpful, but a little too high level and want to dive deeper in, they can now sign up for free survivor specific courses taught by a trained professional. So they're 90 minutes and you can learn about goal setting, budgeting, credit, debt, you name it. And we're really hoping collectively this educational information will help survivors build the financial security they need, again, wherever they are on that journey. That's where we are today. As we look to the future, we want to be really a holistic financial service platform. So in addition to financial education, I'm hoping we can have credit building programs, microloans, and just make it the place you go to holistically build that financial security.
This was part of why I was so impressed when I first met you, was the way that you're looking at the problem, the challenge is through this journey lens, these 4 phases that you just described. And you were asking yourself, how do we support and empower survivors through every step of the way? And how can we add value to people all along that journey? And I think this type of thinking is what we need more of to also foster collaboration in the nonprofit sector. Is where do we fit in the overall journey of the people that we're serving, and how can we create the connections to other services, create partnerships to provide that holistic service? So, are you finding, in terms of those 4 phases, when you were evaluating where do we start, like how did you decide that, okay, this is where we're going to go first? Describe your analysis of the journey and how you came to saying, okay, we want to launch a digital first nonprofit to support survivors.
It all just goes back to what survivors have requested. And we always say survivors lead, and we just build and follow and implement based off their insights and preferences. As we interviewed survivors, it really felt like they were defining their experience in those 4 phases and expressing, at that point, I wanted this, at this point, I wanted that. And it really created the mental model for us as we thought about our organization. And at first, we were like, do we plug into phase 1, 2, 3, or 4? But we found ourselves uniquely positioned after so much research to kind of touch across all of those buckets, because we knew what the questions were and we had the access to both the advocates with a lot of deep expertise on the mission space and a lot of finance experts to kind of address all of those different buckets. I think we'll be diving deeper into different areas as we continue to get feedback, but we've been just so fortunate to kind of straddle both worlds so nicely. And the digital first approach came not only, again, from that 95% statistic of survivors not using formalized support, but also from our partner organizations. A lot of them work with survivors and talk about finance, but they don't have the tools. So in addition to survivors discovering our website independently, we found that people in the mission space will actually sit down and go through the website with survivors. Making it digitally available so that any organization in the country can access us was important as well.
How are you looking at your overall, to use some startup lingo, which is very much applies to the nonprofit space, go-to-market strategy of actually getting FinAbility, raising the awareness, getting it in the hands of state, local, and national level nonprofits? So it sounds like you're well on your way in making some great partnerships, but how are you looking at, the overall ecosystem of nonprofits working to serve survivors, and how you fit in and partner with those organizations at scale?
Yes. So the domestic abuse mission space is organized at the federal, state, and then local level. Community/county level, you have shelters and direct service providers, and they all report, but they all belong rather to coalitions at the state level that provide technical support. And then all those state coalitions actually belong to a national network, which provides technical support to them. And it's been really important to us to make sure we connect federal level to make sure we're fitting into larger themes that are happening across the country. And they provide us a lot of support on tech safety to make sure our resources are meeting the technology needs of survivors. But largely we focus on the state level because through those partnerships, we're able to connect to all of the local direct service providers a little bit more easily and at scale. And for piloting and getting that really rich and qualitative feedback, that's where our partnerships at the county level become really important. But in addition to all the partnerships for go-to-market, SEO is incredibly important to us. We're just really ramping up our focus there, but we are fortunate to be one of the many nonprofits that gets a Google Ad grant. So we're working on our keywords and really just trying to increase our online discoverability.
I was going to go right there is around metrics for success as a digital first nonprofit. What are some of those most important factors to your success? And as digital first, like you've got this funnel of how do people find you, and SEO, search engine optimization, keywords, all of that is very, very important to that funnel. But what are some of the other metrics or measures that you're looking at and measuring where you are and helping you to lay the roadmap of where you want to be?
Absolutely. So we do make sure to look at our impact and metrics both qualitatively and quantitatively. On the quantitative side, we use more traditional web analytics. So we'll look at web traffic, how are people reaching us, how long are they on the site, and where are we losing them? And that allows us to kind of determine, are these actually survivors who are accessing the website and really immersing themselves in it versus maybe someone who clicked on the site, didn't like it, exited, or maybe someone like my mom who just wanted to check in on me and see how the website is doing. But that's a good higher level perspective for us. And then through those focus groups and interviews, we're able to understand the user journey a bit more and understand what's been effective, what isn't, and really fine tune the messaging and the product itself.
That's awesome. And yeah, gosh, there's so much of a like a segmentation challenge of being able to figure out who that is visiting your website are you serving versus, like your mom or like me. Or on the donor front, then what is your strategy with creating transparency with donors and what their donations mean? Because part of what we hope to push with Match Nice is that, creating more transparency and helping donors understand the impact of their donations will inspire them not only to give more, but also build and foster a relationship that could lead to a longer term sustainable partnership between donors and nonprofits. So one of the things that I'll add to that I hope that will help change is this negative perception around nonprofit overhead. Big donors are looking at this ratio of like programming dollars versus overhead. And if it's high, it's like, oh no, that's not, you need the overhead to accomplish the mission. And yes, like there's considerations around like, are you being efficient, and all of that should be looked at, but there's no escaping the factors of like overhead being part of the overall budget and expense for a nonprofit to be effective. So wrapping all of that into a question, how are you communicating impact with donors, and how are you looking at like your biggest expenses and overhead and kind of making donors understand that this is a really critical part of us executing?
It's so challenging. I agree with everything you just said. And especially as a nonprofit startup and a tech startup, our main cost is salary. We're at a point where if you invest an extra couple dollars even on the platform, you're not getting much additional return because we've already optimized the website so that really it's SEO that's increasing our impact metrics, not investments in the product itself, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
So when we're thinking about how to sell this to donors, it's hard because there's not for $30. You could help like X number of survivors access this financial product or resources. We've taken honestly more of just a qualitative message saying, here's a survivor we've worked with and how their life changed. By the end of 2025, we're hoping to reach 500,000 survivors through our website and really hoping that resonates. We need to keep thinking about how do we analyze the data so we can segment it better, so we can present it in a more compelling way to donors, and how do we talk about overhead costs in a way that's not deterring. I honestly get uncomfortable sometimes when I'm talking to donors because I recognize that if someone makes a donation, it's going directly to my personal salary. And even though the idea is to make the organization thrive and to achieve our mission, it can be hard to separate the idea that I'm asking you for money that through this organization goes into my own pocket.
It's interesting you say that. Currently working with a nonprofit where I was working to translate their programming and expenses into donor facing communication online, right? Like you can choose where your donations go. ago, when I was looking at that budget, payroll was the biggest expense. It was the biggest line item on there. There needs to be this shift also, again, from the donor side, from recognizing that these missions aren't possible without livable wages for the people who are making it happen. Like you, Stacy, are the heartbeat behind the entire organization, and you're driving all of the strategic direction with your team and everything, and not recognize that as a legitimate, valid funnel for where donor dollars can go, I think is a big mistake. We at Match Nice also hope to demystify to donors is to recognize that payroll is a really large expense, but historically nonprofits are very hesitant about presenting that because this donor-centric climate that we're in is all about like every dollar needs to like result in, like you said, like X amount of impact. I'm really hopeful that with this podcast and everything that we're doing, and even this conversation that we're having right now, we'll be able to broaden some perspectives to help people recognize that payroll is a critical part and oftentimes, if not the biggest slice of the overall nonprofit expense. And if we can't create livable wages for people driving these missions, then the mission's just possible.
I really appreciate the work you all are doing to create awareness around this. And hardest things for me entering this mission space has been seeing how little the advocates in the mission space often make. And I by no means am blaming the organizations themselves, because they've been set up in a system where they can't increase wages and salaries for a lot of their employees because it won't go over well with donors, or make it not possible for them to hit all these impact metrics that they've promised. And it's devastating, especially with domestic abuse. You have a lot of advocates who are experiencing a lot of secondhand trauma through their day-to-day work, or are being re-traumatized through it, and they're not making a living wage, and they burn out, and they unfortunately have to leave the mission space. And it's a real loss to the organizations and survivors that would otherwise have been supported. And my heart really goes out to them. They're warriors, champions. They're incredible, amazing people. And I think they deserve better. And it's not, again, on the organization, it's the ecosystem that we're forced to operate in right now. And I'm really excited for it to be part of the change. And again, I really thank you all for the work you're doing.
Thanks. Well, we've only taken a similar approach to you in looking at like the problems, the questions, and this is something that has come up over and over again, is reticence around overhead expenses for nonprofits, and hoping to not only broadcast one of the many, many opportunities status quo in the nonprofit sector that needs to change from a donor perspective, but to also create the transparency and empower donors to be able to choose where dollars go in many senses. We did a poll a while back asking if you were given the option as a donor to donate programming or overhead expenses, would you consider donating to overhead expenses? And I think it was something like 78% of donors said they would. So
Oh,
great. It's something that wants to now test in the market, but we don't have the proof points because we're in such an environment at which you only want to put the sexy things in front of the donors. Of all of those things are so critical to the mission actually being happening. So
we had an unexpected expense where we needed to hire a copy editor to go through like this 40-page version of what became our resource guide. And as we started looking to do a smaller fundraiser to support, no one was interested in paying for a copy editor. And it took us explaining, if we have poor language or grammatical errors, we're going to immediately lose the trust of the survivor, and they might not access the helpful information they would have otherwise received if we hadn't had that small error. And it took these longer conversations to really tease out why expense was important. The non-glamorous, like sexy selling point that we would normally go, people access this or that, this kind of financial empowerment. People want the impact like upfront and don't always recognize all of the smaller things that are necessary to make that happen.
well, I think you took the right approach to it, right? It's part of the framework that we're building on. No matter what your expenses as a nonprofit, why are you starting it? What's the need? How does it support your mission? And what's the potential impact? Donors can understand that, then it doesn't matter what that expense is. Like they can clearly see how it fits into the overall equation of impact for a specific organization. And I'm really hoping that that poll rings true and that people, when they do understand what is the potential impact of a copywriter, that it's like, oh, okay, well, this is important and this needs to happen. And here's some dollars to support that. So have you found any particular success in engaging donors around unglamorous expenses that you'd be willing to share?
Well, I will say we're blessed with the board members that we have at our organization. One in particular, our treasurer, Claudia Schechter, she is amazing at making funding requests. And where I'm not comfortable necessarily talking about something going to salary and it really making it possible for me to stay on at the organization in the capacity that I can, she says that for me and is such a champion and can communicate to donors why it's so important. And I think sometimes just having the right person convey the message at the right time, we found really matters. And doing it in a way that's direct, but not confrontational, assuming either.
I love that. The advocacy approach around that makes total sense. And yeah, it is like, we're raising money for our startup right now. And it's such a different pitch when you have someone being like, hey, you should talk to Puya. It's like they're doing this startup. It's amazing versus me being like, check out what we're doing. And
Mhm.
just having that outside perspective and voice on those advocates are so important. So I love that you brought the board member advocacy into the equation. It's a really smart and just intuitive strategy as well. What are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned throughout your startup journey up until this point that just kind of maybe caught you off guard about being a new nonprofit in the sector?
I didn't realize how much patience I'd need and how slowly things would progress. I came from the for-profit world and, I had a lot of friends start for-profit companies the same time I started FinAbility, and they've all closed their seed rounds. Like some of them are looking at Series A at this point and have like full-fledged businesses. And we're so grateful. A few months ago, we got our 501(c)(3, but it took us a year from our filing date to the day we received it. And it's a longer time frame. You apply for a grant, you might not hear back for 3 to 6 months. You might not receive funding for another 3 to 6 months after that. So we have to be really thoughtful about cash flow, about pacing. We rely a lot on partner organizations for our services. So we're also beholden to their timelines and constraints. Patience has made me a better person. And I've come to actually like the slower pace a lot. Consulting was go, 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 go all the time. And I found a lot of peace in being able to have more time for reflection, focus more on relationships, and nothing's more fulfilling, in my opinion, than getting to do a nonprofit. So I'm also very grateful.
No, well, it shows in this conversation just how passionate you are, and the difference that you're making is incredible. And yes, I mean, founder journey is a very difficult one, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. I think that's another recurring theme in this podcast is helping people realize that nonprofit founders are entrepreneurs, they're social entrepreneurs, and what it takes to launch and maintain and sustain and grow a successful nonprofit, there's not too much of a difference between that and any for-profit entity. Maybe just the social purpose and impact focus ROI, the I isn't just
Mhm.
investment and income, it's also impact. So I appreciate that you've chosen this more difficult path, and I've no doubt that you guys will continue to grow and succeed under your leadership. And you say it's a slower pace, but regardless, I know that there's like a lot that goes into the day to day. The response time on certain things may be slower, but the pace of work, I'm sure, never slows down for you all.
There's always more than enough to do, that's for sure.
Well, Stacy, as we look to wrap up our conversation here, what do you want your lasting legacy to be?
I've been thinking about that so much since you posed that to me last time. And I tried to think about it like, oh, maybe there's like a quantitative like impact metric I want to hit one day. But I think it's a lot more like loosey goosey than that. I just want to do everything in my capacity to empower folks to have autonomy and like live a financially secure and happy life and to thrive. And I would love to see a world where no one stays in a relationship because of financial dependency, and people have that empowerment to live the lives that they want to. And I'm hoping I can sense and feel that in the communities I interact with as we build our base of beneficiaries, see and sense that. And hopefully that just spreads. It's about breaking generational trauma too. Like getting one person safe is also going to help their children and their children's children, etc. So I'm hoping we can have that ripple effect.
Well, I think you already are. So thanks for sharing that. And so appreciate this path that you've chosen, the impact you're making, and how thoughtful you've been in the approach of doing that by involving the people that you're serving in every step of the process. And I'm so excited to see the progress that you and the team will continue to make. Check out all the amazing work that Stacy's doing. Stacy, thank you so much for taking the time to share your journey with us and for sharing your insights and the challenges and the opportunities that you're making the most of.
No, thank you so much for having me today. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Talk to you later.
Cheers.
Madeline Ibrahim, welcome back to the Nonprofit Lab. Can you believe this is our 10th episode, 10th debrief that we're doing together?
It's crazy. It has flown by. It feels just crazy.
Well, I am so inspired by the work that Stacy is doing with FinAbility. And the first thing that just opened my eyes, the whole point of our podcast and what we're doing is to learn, to discover. And she is running the very first digital first nonprofit that I'm aware of. What did you guys think about her model and the way that she's only doing it online?
I thought it is extremely customer centric. Puya, you and I have a background in doing things around customer experience. And it was just such an extremely duh moment for me, knowing who your beneficiaries are, people who are survivors of domestic violence, and knowing that the ways that they're going to try to discover ways to get out of those situations is going to be on their, discreetly on their phone or somewhere digital that they can, be silently looking for that kind of information was just of course you should be digital first. And I loved hearing that their site is completely self-sufficient. So there's no need to interact with anyone. You can just get on and start using their resources. It's incredible. And also to hear that other nonprofits or service providers in the DV space are using their site, which is just just a really, really cool story of building something that really serves the people that you're looking to serve.
Definitely. No, I'd say it's always interesting to see the similar approach a lot of these nonprofits are taking, where it's find a set of resources that everyone should have access to, but a majority of people do not, or a majority of people in need do not have access to that, and find a way to reformat it or restructure it so that way they have access to not even that, but a lot more than they even thought was possible. That's definitely what Stacy's doing with the offerings they have, whether it's through the resource guide or through the specific courses they're offering in a variety of areas to their user base.
Totally. And when I said they're only doing it online, that's kind of a misnomer, right? Because they're partnering with other domestic violence focused nonprofits all across the country and providing the resources to elevate the services that they can provide, whether it's at a shelter or at a support group or, along any part of that, what we're calling kind of a beneficiary journey. It just emphasizes the importance of nonprofit partnerships for success and how much more impact that could be had in the nonprofit sector when mission-aligned nonprofits partner up towards the same goals.
I don't know about you, Eve, but in the conversation, Puyo, when you and Stacy were talking about the beneficiary journey, it just painted such a clear picture to me of, we talk about cause areas all the time, right? Animal welfare or, solving hunger or different things like that, right? And a cause area, you kind of can visualize the problem, right? But with the beneficiary journey, talking about, someone who is a survivor of domestic violence and looking at it through that lens of seeing where someone is along the journey of trying to get out of that situation and get back up on their feet, it falls under the cause area of domestic violence, but just seeing it in that kind of, I know that journeys are woggly and winding and not always a straight path, but putting it on through that journey perspective really helped me to say, where do all these different nonprofits and service providers fall along the journey? Where do they touch, this person who's trying to get back up on their feet? And it just made the whole conversation around partnerships and working together and trying to solve a problem really, really clicked for me. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. That was really a great part of the conversation.
I definitely related to that, Madeline. I think building off of that, the whole idea of partnerships and integration and finding people to collaborate with, it's kind of like the foundation of what we're trying to do with Match Nice. We see people focusing on cause areas. Why not work together to exponentially increase impact versus doing everything individually? The other thing is also, based off a previous conversation we had, not viewing the nonprofit sector as a competitive environment, although it sometimes may seem like that. This form of collaboration shouldn't be put into a competitive mindset where it's we have to make sure that we're raising more money or doing more. No, it's how can we both work together to maximize what we're doing and potentially 10x the impact it has on the communities that it would have if we did it by ourselves.
Yeah, that's such a strong point. And it's a theme that's come up at least a few times on this podcast. The notion that nonprofits are very collaborative, can be very collaborative when it comes to programming, but oftentimes are hyper competitive when it comes to competitive funding, right? I really loved Stacy's approach in navigating that climate by offering first, coming to the table to another nonprofit and trying to add value and, opening the door in that way. Madeline, I know in some of the notes that you shared with me, that was one of the things that came up. What were your kind of takeaways from that approach that Stacy had?
Yeah, I really liked the giving first approach that she talked about. And I thought what was most interesting about it, well, one of the most interesting things about it, the eventual mindset shift that she saw happen over time, right? So by starting with giving and kind of disarming yourself and being I'm not here to say what's in it for me, or I'm not here to just take from you, to put yourself as offering something when you're first meeting with anyone, and then seeing that mindset shift happen over time of someone saying, oh, you're not out to get me or anything like that. You're trying to work with me. It's just interesting. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily think to put those two things together. If I give first, then people will think that I'm not out to get them. So that was a really interesting learning. And I think the other thing that's tough about the nonprofit partnerships is that when it comes to being competitive on the funding front, I can understand, we've seen this a lot in our research, but I can understand where it's coming from, that in the short term, you're we need money to stay afloat. We're trying to do good work and we need the funding to stay afloat. And especially hearing how many times have we heard over and over that government funding or grant funding, which is where the majority of funding comes from for a lot of nonprofits, can take months and months and months to come through. So if you lose that big chunk of money that's supposed to be coming in, it's really devastating for you. So I just can't imagine how tough it is to balance between the long-term vision of saying let's all work together and kumbaya to solve this problem versus just we got to have cash to stay afloat. That's got to be a really hard balance to strike.
Yeah, it is a difficult balance. And I appreciate Stacy's approach and bringing that value forward first approach. I mean, that's how the best kind of networking works, right? When you're connecting with someone without any other agenda than to see how you might be able to help that individual or connect that individual to a resource. No expectations other than hey, we are working towards the same thing. Let's explore the possibilities of where this could go. Along the lines of competitive funding and just the need for capital, we discussed overhead expenses as part of the equation and how nonprofits communicate with donors about where their money is going. And payroll is a big part of that. And it was an interesting reaction to see Stacy's kind of response when I said that, what we're trying to do with Match Nice is to make it normal for donors to understand that a good portion of your donation will go to supporting the staff and the people that are actually delivering the mission. This stigma around overhead expenses, while it's an important factor to look at, and you should understand what portion of money is going towards programming versus payroll, et cetera. There's too much weight being put on just that alone. And I'm really hoping that our podcast and these conversations are also helping to educate donors out there that nonprofits need, like, people need to get paid too. And right now we're in this environment where nonprofits aren't talking about that very often, or aren't being transparent about, hey, like, this is how much we're paying our staff, because of this climate of pressure to just every dollar needs to go towards programming, but without the recognition that programming isn't possible without the people at that organization. So wondering what you guys thought of the kind of the conversation and Stacy's reaction to everything about overhead expenses.
I just thought that the analogy that's coming to my head, just as you're giving the recap of it, was imagine planning an event and you book the venue and that's a couple $1,000s, and then you book the caterer and that's a couple $1,000s. You book all these different things and then there's nobody there to make it happen. Like, there's no one there that's actually going to make sure that it's all going according to plan and everything's working together and whatever. Like, the people are essential to all these different things. And you think about as well, if you're any kind of services industry, but especially where you're working with people, for like in this example, where you're working with survivors of domestic violence, I'm just thinking of, imagine having the same person, someone like Stacy, who's helping you and guiding, well versed in everything, has been in this space for years, for decades, right? That's very valuable. Having someone who turns over in Stacy's position every single year, you just diminish the value of what you're offering because people are burning out or they need to move on. I think it's the same thing we talk about, turn of employees or things like that, the costs of the knowledge loss or just relationship loss, just by not valuing people enough and paying them what they're worth. I think it's crazy to me that programming is seen as something sometimes that like has no people working on it. I don't know. It's just kind of wild to me.
I think it was a funny part of the conversation because it's something that a lot of people think about, but they're unsure what to say about it. Payroll is essential. Nonprofits are business. Establish that they operate businesses. They need to raise money or find some kind of revenue model that allows them to accomplish the goals and the missions that they're focused on. It's very difficult to do that when you're trying to justify paying somebody nothing to spend a majority of their life working on something, and everyone needs to have like minimum level of basic life needs met. So you can't expect someone to put 60 hours a week into a nonprofit where it's essentially their full-time job and be paid nothing. And then some people put the argument up of like, they don't even need to be paid that much. Like, you say that, but this one person might be impacting 500 people in the community. And you're saying that their impact isn't worth like a reasonable salary that allows them to put food on the table for their family back home. They're people at the end of the day, and these are their jobs. So I think this goes back to a previous conversation where we can't keep labeling nonprofits as these organizations that are there and need money. Like, it's organizations that have employees that any job, just like the rest of us working for a typical corporation.
Yeah. And I think we've said that message so many times on the podcast about nonprofits are like businesses, they're purpose-driven businesses. But, as we're learning, one of the key differences between, of course, a business and a nonprofit is that, and the success metrics are very different, right? Like, ROI in the for-profit sector is all about maximizing revenue. As a public benefit corporation, we're also able to weave in our purpose of helping increase the flow of capital to nonprofits. But for nonprofits, the ROI, the I, is predominantly impact. And I really loved her thoughtful and methodology around how they're measuring success as a digital first nonprofit, and some of the metrics that they're tracking, from web analytics to just like conversions and all of that. What did you guys think about her approach to measuring impact and success as a digital first nonprofit?
I thought data analytics and SEO work that they're doing, first of all, I think it's great that that's what they decided would be their metrics, right? Because I think that you could be digital first and have completely non-digital metrics that you're measuring yourself on, which I think it's good to have a balance of both, but I appreciate that there is such a heavy focus on SEO and making sure that they're able to be found and all those things that come along with being digital first. I think that it was just very cool to hear her talk about how they've used analytics and are continuing to try to, dig deeper to find out ways that they can improve their messaging and reach the people they want to reach 10x. That was great.
Yeah, when she mentioned SEO, I got excited. It's nice to see that people are finally like looking into the deep side of how the internet works, right? How these search engines operate. At the end of the day, you are going to have a difficult time surviving as a nonprofit if your discoverability is very low. If I look up the cause area you focus on and you're not in the first 10 pages of Google, no one's going to find you, right? Like, I don't go past the first page, honestly, most of the time I
Yeah.
search something. Educating nonprofits should definitely focus at least some of the time on educating themselves and figuring out how to develop an SEO strategy that benefits them both from a discoverability angle, but also from a donor attraction angle. If you want people to be able to stumble upon your website or directly find you as someone focusing on a cause that aligns with them, whether it's in their community, their area, or just a cause they care about on a global scale. So it was very nice to hear that they're focused on that and like the go-to-market strategy. And I think that more nonprofits need to start aligning themselves to taking this more modernized approach versus hoping and praying that things will work out, because it's not really how things work anymore.
Yeah, 100%. And that was one of the things that we learned very early on in our discovery. We had nonprofit leaders tell us, as we were thinking about ways to design this impact-centric donation like experience on a website, like, don't take my traffic away from my site. And so the way we designed Match Nice was for every word, every piece of text about what that nonprofit is working on, what donations mean in terms of impact, lives on the nonprofit site and is searchable and contributes to that nonprofit search engine optimization. So I'm excited to see, hopefully, competitors take that same angle, because a lot of what is out there right now is very disjointed. It lives on a separate page that's hosted by the fundraising platform, and we've decided to take a very different approach to that. I'm kind of at the bottom of some of my notes here. Madeline, what else do you have?
I just had another note about impact, which is it was so devastating to hear that a lot of people aren't being paid and I think Stacy was referencing to the DV space, but I'm sure that this is happening everywhere, that people aren't being paid a livable wage at organizations like theirs, because by paying them more, the organization can't hit impact metrics that they promised to donors. And that was like, oh, yikes. It was just such a sad sentence to hear. And also just reminded me of some conversations that we've had here on the podcast talking about a reality check on impact metrics and how thinking about realistic impact, and it's not to say that their impact metrics are not realistic, but just thinking about like takes time. You don't solve these huge problems overnight. And just to hear that that's what the trade-off was as like livable wage or hit our impact metrics, it's like, oh, I don't know. That was a hard one to hear, that like short-term thinking of running someone ragged, not paying them enough to hit certain numbers versus kind of like being more realistic about like, hey, that's going to take longer or whatever, while taking care of your people in the meantime, or as that's happening.
Totally. I think that topic came up in our episode with Rashida and Anna Barber, Ask a Fundraiser. I think that was episode 7, where, part of the skills gap in the nonprofit sector is the disparity in pay. It's wild to think that the nonprofit sector, I believe, behind manufacturing and technology, is like either the second or the third largest workforce in the United States. 10% of the US workforce is working in the nonprofit sector. A lot of them have to make this trade-off, and it's unfortunate that we're in this situation where it's like, to choose to work on something that is mission aligned and that you're really passionate about for lower pay, or work in a for-profit sector setting where you might gain a little bit more earnings and capital. But that we can be part of the solution of leveling that playing field in the future, and starting with just raising the awareness to the disparities that exist. What else, Madeline? What else do you have on your organized list of notes, my COO?
A couple other things I had were, one that I think, well, I have 4. One is about how they did their research, and they didn't just talk to beneficiaries to see where they could fill the gaps. They talked to other service providers in their space, like their own competitive landscape. I thought that was interesting.
Totally. Just the fact that they spent so many hours and so much time, so many interviews discovering the needs of survivors and people working in the DV space, who are almost the majority of them are also survivors themselves. Yeah, that informed approach is something that's come up in previous episodes. I think like Tiffany Yao mentioned, like her nonprofit Fulfill has taken that approach as well. And something that we're doing. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point.
I don't know if they would have discovered the interesting fact that many people, like you just said, many people working as service providers in the DV space are survivors themselves and don't necessarily have the financial background or like knowledge or skill set. Like, I don't know if people if the beneficiary group would necessarily be aware of that versus talking to people who are on the other side and the service provider side to say, like, this is a skills gap that I have, like, I just thought that was such an interesting approach. And I don't know if many people or organizations do that and, ask, it's not necessarily your competition, but people that are out serving the same group as you to see where you might fit in to fill a gap there. So yeah, that was cool.
Yes, as my wife, officially a doctor in clinical psychology.
Hey.
Congratulations. Would say, community-based participatory research is like, or human-centered design in the business world is so important, right? Like designing and building for the people you're trying to serve based on their actual needs and not just what you think they need. Very, very important.
Yeah, the point that she made about great partnerships, where one of their first great partners said, we needed to know you were listening before we could kind of like decide to move this partnership forward. That was another thing that really resonated with me. It kind of goes back to the giving first approach. Yeah, it's coming in, like you said, Puya, with no particular agenda and just saying, like, I'm here to learn. And I think that's hard to come by, just coming into a conversation with open ears. Not very common.
But it works really well.
It works.
Eve, any other points or notes that you had on your ledger?
Most of them we talked about, but the last point I had was just a comment she made where she essentially just said patience is key when you're running a nonprofit. It's one of the biggest things you need to survive as a nonprofit. Otherwise, you'll fall into this hole of like, why are things not going my way? Which I feel like we can relate to in the startup sector. It's patience is key, patience and necessity. Otherwise, it wouldn't feel like as much of a challenge as it is. It's definitely, whether it's the nonprofit sector or the startup sector, I think it's definitely a grounding experience where you kind of are forced to look back, understand that like things come when the time's right. So no point in questioning why things happen the way they do.
Patience is definitely a foundational element, but that doesn't imply that they're just kind of waiting around, right?
Exactly.
It's like it's a combination of patience, persistence, tenacity, grit, drive, like all of these factors that make a really good founding team, whether they're a nonprofit or a startup. So sorry, Madeline, you were going to say?
I just was going to build off of what you guys were saying, which is I just thought we as founders of Match Nice could really relate to where Stacy is in her journey with FinAbility, about knowing what your bigger vision is and deciding where you're going to start now. Like we as Match Nice have such a grand vision for what we want to do with our company, but we are also in that stage of, but we're going to start here. And, just knowing that we have to be patient, persistent, working towards, closing the gap towards our larger vision. But yeah, that just resonated with me as a founder as well, when she was talking about her larger vision as FinAbility for a larger platform than what it currently is today.
So many points of connection. I feel so grateful to have had the opportunity to interview Stacy, and I feel like we definitely learned a lot from this conversation in this episode. Madeline, Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining yet another debrief, our 10th debrief. I look forward to seeing you both on the next episode.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye. Well, folks, that wraps up another episode of the Nonprofit Lab. Episode 10 is in the books for our listeners that have been following us on this journey of discovery. Thank you so much. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Every rating that we get means a ton to our podcast and our efforts on this journey of discovery. To end on a quote like we always do, this one from Frederick Douglass, who said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. We thank all of the nonprofits out there working towards the good struggle and appreciate you listening to another episode of the Nonprofit Lab. Have a great one.